there is some hope that, now Russia is almost overnight a democracy, or at least it's got a lot of democratic aspects that it didn't have before, that this will mean the Russians will fight on with greater spirit. They'll fight for new gods. They will fight for freedom in a way that they hadn't. But obviously this does not ever really happen. And so the Russian army begins to deconstruct. It begins to fall to pieces.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Nick Lloyd. He's a professor of modern warfare at King's College London, the author of Some Years Past, Our Conversation, the Western Front. Now, the next part, the Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. And this is very unknown to me, and so it was a great pleasure to learn what had often been mentioned as Russia versus Austria-Hungary. Always the Austro-Hungarians were begging for German troops. And in our conversation 3 years ago about the Western Front, there was also the attention of these men, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, would eventually show up on the Western Front and be the drivers of the closing stages of the war when America got in. And their reputation, however, was built on their conduct in the Eastern Front. So it was all a mystery to me. This new book, enormously detailed and persuasive, introduces the Eastern Front where the Germans won. That's critical to understand what we're about to describe. Germany wins in the East. The defeat, as we remember it 100 years or more later, was in the West. Professor Nick, congratulations. A very good evening to you. We begin, however, not in a battlefield, but on the assassination of Archduke in Sarajevo in the summer of 1914. His death triggers a cavalcade of decision-making across this vast map of Europe. Why? What was so brittle about Austria-Hungary at this moment that the aging monarch, emperor, Franz Joseph, felt he was compelled to, what did he say, grasp the sword after so many years of peace? Good evening to you, Nick.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me on. It's great to talk about these things. And that question, why does the assassination spark the First World War is one that historians always go back to, because it's almost that point at which all the cataclysms of the 20th century kind of spring from in many ways. And so that question is a deep one, and it's very difficult to answer, but it's obviously a combination of factors, I think, which means the assassination becomes so much more than simply the kind of killing or the murder of one member of the Austro-Hungarian royal family. It becomes an event that brings all of these power struggles which have been going on in the decades before the war, these kind of sense of weakness or of decline that many European states had felt. Austria-Hungary feels it, Germany feels it, Russia feels it, a sense that things are getting away from them, slipping away. And therefore, for Austria-Hungary, this is a moment where they feel they have to strike back. They have to put Serbia, this rising power, this quite aggressive state, in its place. Because if they don't, they will be made to look weak. There will be this will kind of confirm all the fears that they had in the Habsburg Empire in the years coming up to the war of defeat, of decline. The empire was bound to fall, crumbling. And therefore, unless we make a firm stand here, nobody will believe anything we say anymore. And so that's one of the reasons why they feel they have to take action against Serbia. But of course, this is not they're not allowed to do that because the other powers get involved.
They do get involved right away. There are some coincidences here that look like the devil's in charge. I believe the president of France, Poincaré, is at the time in Petersburg visiting with the Czar's family. And Germany and Russia and France are allies at this time. They will become part of the Entente. Now, the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo and the belief in Vienna that Serbia did this. In fact, we know now there was Serbian hand everywhere in an organization sometimes called the Black Hand. and the assassination was driven by Serbian state security. The Tsar, though, why does he get involved? Why does the Russian mobilization follow immediately without an exploration of the assassination or any exchanges between Franz Joseph and Nicholas and the Kaiser? Why didn't they talk about it?
Well, I think there's a similar feeling of decline and concern in St. Petersburg about this, that if we don't protect Serbia, our chief client state in the region, will be seen to be weak. And if we allow the Austrians to get away with this in the way that they annexed Bosnia, Herzegovina before the war, and again, we'll be made to feel weak. And so obviously there is, there are communication, there is the sort of letters between the Kaiser and the Tsar, and there is a sense of actually things rapidly becoming out of control. And of course, the Russians believe that they need to act quickly, and therefore they know that their army is going to take quite a while to mobilize. And so therefore they want to get on the front foot and act quickly. And of course, this really sets the cat amongst the pigeons, and of course gets Germany very, very concerned about this. And so very rapidly, the assassination and the fallout of it brings about those, the cataclysm of the Eastern Front, and then of course the Western Front.
Yes, the mobilization between July and August is rapid, and it's like dominoes falling. Russia is half mobilizes, so France and then Germany, and all of the states now are poised for a contest, which once again they believe is going to be over quickly. There will be a battle, it will end. The German anticipation, however, was not the Eastern Front. That was to be a holding action. Their anticipation was the Western Front, the plan to overwhelm France immediately the way they had done in 1870. This is driven by a man named Falkenhayn, who is the overall commander of the German forces, but comes to be the dominant player with the Austro-Hungarian forces. What do we need to know about Falkenhayn?
Well, I mean, there are a number of key players on the German side at the start of the war. I mean, obviously, we've already mentioned the Kaiser. The chief of the general staff at the start of the war is Helmut von Moltke, and he is one of the key players as well. And he effectively has a nervous breakdown in September, mid-September. So only a matter of weeks before the war breaks out, he has a nervous breakdown, and feels that he just simply cannot carry on. Of course, he's moved aside, and then you have the Prussian war minister, Erich von Falkenhayn, who comes in. And he's the man that basically leads the German war effort for the next 2 years. And so Falkenhayn is a very important figure. And what I detail in the book very much is Falkenhayn's, the attempt by Germany to build a war strategy to win and to respond to the events, because they're not able to win in the West. He tries that. They try that, but they can't do it. Ultimately, the French and the British are able to hang on in the West, and therefore Germany is faced with a two-front war. And so that's Falkenhayn's issue, is how to deal and build a war strategy in a very difficult situation, and one where not only are they not able to win in the West, but you also have Austria-Hungary becoming increasingly fragile as the war goes on. Very quickly, actually. The war starts badly, and I think that's what you see is this war just gets very bad very, very quickly. It's like they go off a cliff, or they go off a huge waterfall, all the powers, and they cannot get back to it. And you see that very, very clearly in the August and September of 1914. It's an absolute, it's a roller coaster.
Yes, you mentioned that they were arrogant, all of them, in thinking that war was manageable. And what happens is escalation and the unknown. The replacement of von Moltke with Falkenhayn happened after a success in the East, but again, it wasn't considered primary. It was secondary to the battle for Paris. This is Hindenburg and Ludendorff at Tannenberg. What did the Russians learn from Tannenberg? That this is East Prussia, after all. The Germans are playing on their home court. Why did Russia attack?
Well, Russia is, it wants to fight the Austrians. The Austrians, it knows, are weak. It has territorial gains that it wants to gain against Austria. Obviously, it wants to push its border out to the Carpathians, which made the Czar sees as a sort of natural border of the Russian Empire in the West. So they want to fight the Austrians, but of course they've got 7/8 of the German army are going to go west. And so this is the French plan. The French are constantly screaming at the Russians that if you're going to fight now, you must send as much as you can against Germany. You will never have a better chance of marching on Berlin. The Russians don't really want to do that, but they do send two armies into East Prussia. I guess it's the sort of minimum they could get away with, really. But the two armies are uncoordinated. They're not entirely sure what they're doing. Two army commanders don't really talk to each other. And then you have this situation where the German Eighth Army, which is the only force they have in the East, is able to hold off one of those armies, rapidly redeploy, and conduct a double envelopment of the Russian Second Army at Tannenberg between about the 26th and the 30th of August, 1914. And three entire corps are destroyed or captured. And so Tannenberg is one of the most decisive battles of the war. And it at a stroke, it decimates the Russian army in the north and sends a huge signal to the Tsar that the Germans are really to be feared. And so it really gets the Russian war effort off to a very, very bad start. They're able to do quite well against the Austrians, but they can never deal with the Germans. And so Tannenberg and the two German commanders who are mainly responsible for it, the Eighth Army commander Paul von Hindenburg and his chief planning aide Erich Ludendorff, and they work very, very closely together. And they are the people that actually pull Tannenberg off. And of course, they come out of this, with a glowing reputation. The men that actually entered 1914 with a huge victory. And of course, that means that they're increasingly influential and powerful. And Tannenberg at a stroke almost reorientates German strategy. Previously to the war, it had been to win in the West. After Tannenberg, Hindenburg and Ludendorff say, no, we can win in the East.
The book is The Eastern Front. Nick Lloyd, professor of modern warfare at King's College in London. It is September, October 1914. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this product of mixed nationalities, so many that there's one or two or five of everything in each regiment. Nick very carefully explicates that this is a hybrid army. Goes up against the Russians in a place called Galicia, which we now think of as the bloodlands between Russia and Western Europe. This is part Poland, part Ukraine. It's all mixed up. But at the time, it was called Galicia. And the two armies clash in Galicia. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right away, a man named Conrad von Hötzendorf, is in charge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What do we need to know about him, Nick?
Conrad is a man who obviously runs the Austro-Hungarian army and has pressed for war numerous times before the war. He wants to fight Serbia. He wants to reassert Austrian predominance in the Balkans. Only an aggressive stance can drag the empire back to its predominant position. But Conrad is, he's a dreamer in some respects, and he doesn't understand or he doesn't recognize the limitations of the army. And so Conrad is always dreaming of these grand offensives. And in some cases, many of these offensives are quite good on a map. They're very promising. He can spot where the enemy is weak, areas, potential for flank attacks and things like this, envelopments. But ultimately, the army can never do it. Like the fragile army of the Habsburg Empire can never really do what Conrad wants. And so he's constantly on the back foot. They're not able to defeat Serbia in 1914. They get kicked out. A disastrous campaign. And then they're tangling with the Russians. And that's like a sort of light middleweight going up against a heavyweight. They can throw some punches, they can move they can move around, they can dance around a bit, but sooner or later that weight of power is going to tell. And that's really what happens. And so Conrad, very early on in the war, has the stuffing knocked out of him, comes in very confident. By December, his army's a rabble, and he doesn't know what to do with it. He loses one of his sons, actually, in 1914 as well, in September. And so that has a shattering effect on him. And so Conrad is really a central figure of the book. And I think in many ways a misunderstood figure. He's one of the great figures of the war, but fundamentally flawed, I think.
The attack is not successful. The Russians have huge amounts of manpower, some very good guns. And what emerges here is the way the war was fought. Today, we think about drones and missiles. It was a transition time for commanders. Conrad, I learned from Nick, believed in the bayonet and infantry, whereas what evolves over the next 2 years is artillery, 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 and trench warfare follows accordingly. Did Conrad ever accept the fact that he was outgunned by the Russians and undergunned by his own preparation?
I mean, to a certain degree, it isn't his fault. I think, like many commanders at the time, he did believe in the offensive spirit, in the importance of grasping the initiative in war, and in conducting decisive attacks. The Austrian army is chronically underfunded in peacetime. There's huge, arguments over budgets. They don't have enough artillery. The artillery they do have is very light, weak, fragile. Often they've got bronze barrels because of underfunding. And those often warp or break entirely after intensive firing, so they're not reliable. And so Austria is very light in terms of the artillery it's going to need. It has some light artillery, but it is probably one of the lighter armed armies of the war. And the Russians don't have enough guns, but they have more than the Austrians, and so rapidly the Russians dominate Austrian forces. And I think that's really one of the key issues. It's not that Conrad necessarily doesn't understand modern warfare, although I suspect there is some element of that. It's that he doesn't really have another way of attacking. He has to use manpower because he simply doesn't have anything else. And, he has asked for more funding before the war, and that's never come. And so I think in some ways that's more inexplicable, the fact that Conrad seems to understand Austrian weaknesses, but still thinks they're a first-class army that can do these grand offensives, and of course they never really can. The casualties the Austrians suffer is just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, they're just absolutely decimated. And the fact that they managed to hang on until 1918 is, in some ways, an absolute miracle, because they're absolutely, they're really badly handled in the early days of 1914 when it breaks out. And, they managed to keep going, which is quite incredible, really.
The book is The Eastern Front, Nick Lloyd, the professor of modern warfare, King's College London. A History of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. This is part of Nick's trilogy. To my knowledge, I've read and spoken with Nick about the Western Front, which was the extent of my knowledge of the First War until Nick provided me the Eastern Front. We're now looking at what the High Command in Germany believed was secondary. They poured their efforts and their soldiers and their thinking about winning into the Western Front. The Eastern Front was always necessary to hold on to, but not necessary to win. So whenever the Austro-Hungarians got into trouble, we have a pattern of having either asking for aid from Germany or Germany offered troops. The Russians have overwhelming manpower, but they're led by, I don't think I can call it superstition. The Czar has an unusual power over the army of Russia, and he has a lot of generals who are more worshipful than they are effective on the battlefield. The Germans enter into a contest with the Russians along with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and from late 14 to the middle of 15, they're successful. Why, Nick? Why was it this hybrid army of Austro-Hungary joined with Germans who were very effective troops? How is it that they were able to crack the Russians? What did the Russians do wrong?
Well, I think the Russians are always torn in a way that where to move on the front, where to attack. And as I said before, they want to attack the Austrians, but they're always aware that if they press the Austrians too much, the Germans are going to come in. And that's ultimately what happens. As the Austrians get into trouble, they start repeatedly calling for German help. And Germany really has no choice but to bring troops east. So about a third of the German army is eventually deployed on the Eastern Front, and it's around a third for the entire war, at least once the war gets bogged down. And these troops are able, obviously, to take over more of the front from the northern sector, and then they gradually take over Austrian units and begin to put in key staff officers in key positions. And so that's really where the Austrians start to lose control of the war, because ultimately they're too weak. They don't call the shots anymore. And the Germans, Falkenhayn essentially believes that he's going to have to attack in the east. He doesn't really want to. He doesn't really believe Russia can be defeated. He remembers 1812 and the march on Moscow, and believes the Russians can simply withdraw. But he believes that they're going to need to do something to keep the Austrians on board. And so they mount this attack at Gorlice Tarnov, which is one of those crucial points on the front, which really unhinges the Russian defense. And the Russians really don't have the capabilities to react quick enough to this. And so they rapidly find themselves being outpaced, really. And the Russians, I mean, there are supply shortages all across the front, but the Russians are also sort of struggling with officer casualties, lack of rifles, lack of boots, all these kind of things. There's at least, hundreds, I don't know the actual numbers, but there are hundreds of thousands of troops being held back in Russia because they cannot be sent to the front without rifles. And so very early on, both Austria and Russia get into trouble in the east. And so it's quite a remarkable dynamic that you see here, where the Germans, by as early as the summer and sort of autumn of 1915, the Germans are really calling the shots here. They're determining, German and Austrian strategy.
We're going to stay with the Russians, but first a note. This is a world war in which the Allies contain friends and maybe friends and wannabe friends and leave us alone. Now, one part of this war that is difficult to see now that we're talking about Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, which is the main continent, is Italy. Italy is allied with Russia and France and Britain, and it is driving up the peninsula into Romania and Italy and onto Austria. The passes here are critical to understand, but there's one great big river called the Isonzo. And when Nick introduced it to me the first time, I had to look at the map to see, because it never was part of my education. The Isonzo campaign, not only the first battle, but there are 10 of them. Maybe there's more than 10. Last one I remember is 10 battles. What does that terrain look like? Why was that the front line between them? Because it's a north to south river.
Yeah, and I think this is we have this idea of the Eastern Front being the Russian, Austrian, German war in the north, and that's the traditional Eastern Front. But what you see is this war in Eastern Europe and the Balkans as it rapidly grows and evolves, and so the Italians come in almost at the same moment that the Germans are counterattacking in the east at Gorlice Tarnov that I just talked about. The Italians join the war on the side of the Western Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. And the Italians, obviously they're going to strike into Austrian territory, and that's really, given the mountainous terrain on that border, the Isonzo is the least mountainous border region, even though itself is huge hills and ridges and mountains over that river. And so the campaign in the Italian front probably has the most difficult terrain of any front in the war. And, crossing the Isonzo and getting to that far bank and those hills where the Austrians are dug in is a very difficult thing. And that's why the Isonzo campaign is so stubborn, so long, so bitter, and so brutal. And there's actually 12 battles of the Isonzo, which is, again, is absolutely incredible.
The commander of the Italians at this point is Cadorna, a man who has strong opinions and organizes his troops and keeps at it. Although I was always reminded of that old proverb about madness being the same thing that doesn't work each time and you don't learn. Who was Cadorna? What do we need to know about him? Because eventually he'll be disgraced and relieved.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously commands the Italian army through most of the war from 1915 or to sort of November of 1917, where the army almost collapses entirely at Caporetto. He's a man that obviously is of his time. He believes in the offensive spirit, bayonet, unyielding offensive general. And in some ways, he has one of the worst reputations of any general of the First World War. I mean, there's a lot of generals with bad reputations, but the Italian front seems to have kind of attracted that. And I think he's very, very tight on discipline as well, which is one of the reasons his troops really dislike him, that any minor infraction or you'll be sacked. Or there's examples on the Italian front of a number of examples of huge numbers of death, soldiers being executed, including a number of examples of decimation, where units will be, a number of individuals within a unit will be randomly selected and executed if there are disciplinary issues. And so the Italians really despise him in many ways. I mean, I think he does try different things. He's obviously being ordered to try and break the Austrian lines, and he does try some different things. And I detail this in the book. If you go through all of those battles that we mentioned, he does try different things. He doesn't have enough artillery, and I think he doesn't realize early on, and really after the second or third battle, he's actually thinking about, actually, this is going to require a lot more than I had anticipated. More artillery, more engineering resources, more supplies, more shells, more preparation. We're not going to be able to go through these defenses cleanly. We're going to have to bite off little sections at a time. And so he is trying to do it. But the Italians always struggle with many of the things that the other armies struggle with. They don't have enough artillery. The ground is terrible. They don't have enough specialist infantry. They begin to improve as the war goes. They do improve. I think that's very clear. But yeah, he is a man, I think, that is generally regarded as one of the most aggressive and unpleasant individuals of that war.
There are a number of pieces now that are around the edges of these large battles between the Germans and the Hungarians and the Russians, and Italy and the Austro-Hungarians. And I want to attend to them just quickly because it's happening. These are simultaneous. The Salonika front was all new to me, Nick. This looked like a miniature Gallipoli, sending British and French troops to secure the Greek port of Salonika, to strike at Austria from the south, I guess was the original plan. But it never seemed well organized. And I think at this point, I began to wonder where's the chiefs of staff meeting? That wasn't something they did early in the war. There was no coordination, or at least there were a lot of complaints about no coordination.
Yeah, I mean, you get the war widens as the war goes on. So obviously Serbia is finally overthrown in the autumn of 1915 with German help. Falkenhayn sends an army in, German commander with the Austrians, and they finally get rid of Serbia. They conquer Serbia. The Bulgarians come in at this point. And it's with the Serbians are retreating from their lines, and then the Allies decide that they really should do something to support Serbia, and so they land at pretty much the only place they can get to that's remotely near there, which is of course the port of Salonika, or Thessaloniki as we know today, and then march north into Serbia. But this campaign is always very controversial. No one is very keen on it. The British Chief of General Staff doesn't want to do it. The Prime Minister feels he has to do it to support the French, who want to do it. But so that the arguments over Salonika, and I detail these in the book, go on almost through the entire war, with the British numerous times threatening to pull out because they think, what are we doing here? We're sending troops to get immobilized in this terrible theater where it's not going to be decisive. And so Salonika retains a reputation as being, what was that all about? And still, people still struggle with it today. But yeah, it's an indication of how the war widens. And there's no sooner that the Germans and the Austrians close down one front than another front opens. It's like sort of these lemmings are popping up everywhere. It's quite remarkable.
Yes, Austria-Hungary. Vienna celebrates Montenegro. I said, what? Montenegro? This is a success, but they needed a success. And then the Germans roll over Romania. Does that happen in this period too? Is 1915?
Romania comes into the war in August of 1916. So this is obviously about a year later, where the Romanians come in, and that's the sort of last real entry into the war. The Romanians have been bargaining and haggling for both sides for a while, and they come in, and they get rolled over in a lightning campaign by the end of 1916. But yeah, it's an indication of how unstable the Balkans really are, and all the states in the Balkans are, looking at each other and trying to decide when the moment is right and when they can get most of it, what they want territorially. And so, yeah, it is pretty unsavory what happens in the Balkans at this point, and the Allies are really struggling to have any influence in this theater at all.
The big story, however, is the Russian retreat that takes place in late 15. And when we come back, the Tsar takes command. Nick Lloyd is the author, professor of modern warfare at King's College London. The book is The Eastern Front: A History of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. We last left the Russians not doing very well against a combination of Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungary Empire, Conrad, and the Germans led by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, although their overall commander is Falkenhayn. And Falkenhayn is not generous, but they make successes so much that the Russians retreat. That is what Russia knows to do when it's defeated, is to give up position and then draw the enemy in, knowing their supply lines will weaken them eventually. The Russians retreat from May to September of 15, and then they figure they've retreated enough. But what's important here is the Tsar taking command around this time. And you would think he would take command because he was unhappy with his generals. No, he took command, at least the way I want to read it, because of his deep and abiding trust and love for the Tsarina. Do I overstate that, Nick? Was he influenced that heavily by his wife?
He seems to be. He's, I mean, obviously a lot has been written about Nicholas II and his, cataclysmic reign in Russia. Obviously, you have this army that is retreating at speed. It is falling to pieces in that summer of 1915, and so he feels he must come to the front. Now, initially, he could have taken charge of the army in 1914, but he doesn't really feel up to it or feel able to do it, and so Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich takes over, and as a man as he's an experienced cavalryman. He's had long, he's trusted by the Romanovs, and he still gets on very, very well with the Tsar. But the Tsar says, "Look, I can't really have this. The army's retreating. Let me take over." And this decision is controversial at the time, and many of the Tsar's advisors are saying, "Well, do you really want to be in charge now? Because you will be tied to any victory or defeat. So if the army continues to stumble, you may be blamed, and this may not be good for you." But the Tsar and his wife, they believe that actually this is really what he should be doing. Now, the Tsarina is always on at Nicholas II to be firmer, be stronger, be more of an autocrat, be more unyielding, bend events to your will. And he's naturally not really like that. He's quite he always struggles with that side of life, and he's obviously a deeply devoted family man. Uh, he doesn't really know that much about how to war. I mean, making war in this period is very, very difficult. And so he comes in and he has a chief of staff, General Alexeyev, who's good, but the Tsar's tenure as commander in chief is really disastrous. They're able to recover somewhat the following year, but ultimately the damage is really done, and the regime is beginning to really struggle.
Nick, I want to understand Russia's thinking, what they wanted to achieve in the retreat. They got into this war to save Serbia. Serbia will fall soon enough. So why did they stay in the war? Is this back to your lessons learned? One of them is they must not be perceived as weak. Was that the reason?
Well, they're tied into the alliance with the Allied powers not to consider a separate peace. So France, Britain, Germany are not allowed to do that. Now, obviously, they could if they decided to break with the Allies. But at this point, they don't feel that they really want to do that because obviously the Allies are sending them money. There's huge loans. They're sending them equipment, and there's lots of stores that are coming via the north, and so they're still dependent to a significant degree on their allies. So they don't necessarily want to do this. And I think obviously there's a fear that if they were to sign a peace with Germany that would leave them weakened, which would undoubtedly will, that this would be devastating for the integrity and the prestige of the regime. I mean, it doesn't take much to realize why they didn't and actually believe that actually we can get out of this, the tide will turn.
Yes,
And so they carry on.
Let's go to that last throw of the Russian Empire. This is the Brusilov offensive, June to September of 1916. Who's Brusilov?
Alexei Brusilov is probably the most well-known general in the Russian Empire at this point. He is a man that has sort of almost come up from quite humble beginnings, and he doesn't go to the Russian Staff College or the Russian General Staff, and so he has sort of a different approach. Brusilov is really the only man in the army that actually is aggressive enough or wants to take the offensive. By this point, most of the Tsar's generals are very, very nervous about taking offensive action on the Eastern Front. They would rather just hold their lines and hope something turns up. But Brusilov believes that with the right techniques, the right technology, the right tactics, they can do something. And he's absolutely right. By this point, the Russians have improved. They have more shells. They have better guns. They've got more heavier guns. And they're copying a lot of the tactics that they're being used on the Western Front. The French are obviously giving them tactics that they use about different types of artillery barrages, artillery registration, aerial reconnaissance. And so in the summer, beginning on 4th of June, there's a real offensive against the Austrian Southwest Front. And Brusilov, is the man that really does this. And this is devastating for the Austrians. They lose an army in about 72 hours. An entire army is basically just disappears. And they're able to make serious gains of ground. And this is one of the reasons the Romanians come in, because the Brusilov offensive is rapidly chewing through the Austrians. The offensive grinds to a halt at some point by the end of the summer. The Germans rush in reinforcements, and that slows things down. So it's not decisive, but it really highlights that in the right context, the Russians can be effective.
The book is The Eastern Front. This is a companion to the professor's The Western Front, thinking of the Great War that redraws the map of the 20th century and that we live with today. This is the battle between Germany on the map today and Russia and all those lands in between that in the Second War were the nightmares called bloodlands. Here in the First War, the empires, the Romanov Empire in Russia, the Hohenzollern, the Habsburg, the British Empire, are tangling on roads and railroad lines and mountain passes that are inadequate for modern warfare, but they're sludging along. The casualties are numbing. Nick is very careful to give us all the numbers. And when you think about a success only leading to 200,000 casualties, only 200,000 casualties or more, that tells you the understanding at the command level of what they're achieving. The idea of finding a hole, breaking through, roaming around, the monarch falling. These terms are thrown around for 14, 15, and 16, but it's now early 1917. And there are events here that seem operatic and tragic, yes, but operatic tragedy. A man named Rasputin. Nick, this is a mystery that I've known about, especially how many times they tried to murder him in January of 17. Who was he? And why did the aristocracy believe his death was necessary to save the kingdom?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the life and legend of Rasputin is indelibly linked with the fate of Nicholas II and his family. And I mean, ultimately, the story has often been told. He is a mystic, a holy man, a man of seeming great hypnotic power and charisma. And the Tsarina believes that Rasputin has a way to heal her son, Alexei. Of course, has hemophilia and has these bleeding episodes, which are obviously deeply worrying for the family. And there was one occasion where Rasputin sits with the boy and prays with him, and bleeding seems to stop. And of course, from this point onwards, the Tsarina is spellbound by this man. And of course, listens to him and tells her husband about what Rasputin wants and why Rasputin needs to be brought into more of the decision making. But of course, this figure, this sort of unseemly monk, holy man, rapidly becomes a figure of great concern across Russia. They see this man as being, so parts of Russia believe he is a great holy man. Others believe he's a Russian agent. He's evil. And so the figure of Rasputin is heaven sent for German propagandists to, to flood the Russian lines with um, obscene pictures of Rasputin and the Tsar's sort of daughters, and the sort of Rasputin becomes a kind of figure that seems to embody the corruption of the Russian state. And so when things go from bad to worse on the front, it doesn't take long for people to blame Rasputin. Of course, he's murdered by members of the aristocracy in December of 1916 in Petrograd. And they believe that this man is bringing the empire to its knees, and therefore he has to be, he has to be got rid of. And so the story of Rasputin really is very much linked with what happens to the Tsar and the kind of loss of confidence that the Tsar suffers from his generals and his chiefs of staff, because they are worried about Rasputin, there's no doubt, but the Tsar will not listen.
The labor strife, the challenge of the workers, the response of the Cossacks, the Bloody Sunday, and then the events in Petrograd. The Tsar is not in residence at the time. He's hearing about this from his counselors and from men who would be the minister. But this becomes a tussle in the Tsar's mind, at least the way I read it. Nicholas thinks, I'm accountable only to God. How can I share leadership of the empire? Was it that simple for him? If he appointed a ministerial cabinet, he no longer was accountable to God, or he had somehow broken the relationship with God?
Yeah, I mean, you have this outbreak of disorder, food strikes and riots in Petrograd, which carries on, and then there is concerns. This is February of 1917, and there are concerns that the army is not reliable in Petrograd in the barracks. And so they rapidly lose control of the city. And of course, this is the city that's at the heart of Russia's war effort, and most of the factories are there. Huge labor population of workers and Bolsheviks, things like that. And so the Tsar, initially is tempted to sort of dismiss all of this concern. He's going to put a general in charge to go back into the city, and things will be normal. He cannot abdicate. He's appointed by God, as you said. But ultimately, it's his generals that get round him and actually tell him they've lost confidence in him. Alexeyev, his chief of staff, General Ruski, who's one of the army commanders there, they make it clear to the Tsar that I think this is for the Tsar's generals. This is a really important moment because they're having to recalibrate their loyalty. Now, when it becomes evident that they're not entirely sure whether they can put this revolt down, they have to reconsider their loyalty, whether their loyalty is to the Tsar or whether their loyalty is to a greater Russia, a Russia that might be moving in a more democratic, accountable direction. And so ultimately, it's a palace coup in many ways. The Tsar is effectively, persuaded that if his abdication will help restore order, and that once he abdicates, order will be restored very quickly. A provisional government can be formed. They can form a representative government, and that this will enable the war to be prosecuted more effectively. Now, this is a tragic delusion. Ultimately, they don't realize what they've unleashed. And the Tsar is weak. One of the people around him said he knew how to lose. He lost well. And ultimately, this is the Tsar. He lacks the kind of driving will of an autocrat that needs to bend things to his will. He lacks that willingness and ultimately gives up. And of course, chaos follows.
Yes, he's also filled with self-pity. Born for misfortune, I think, is the quote you give us.
That's how he describes himself. He says, my reign has begun badly and it's going to end badly. Yes.
And Alexeyev, a very important figure at this point. I want to emphasize him. He is the man who works morning to night at Stavka, at the command headquarters. Alexeyev, what's his opinion of the Tsar at this moment?
Alexeyev, I think, is one of the most interesting figures of the Russian war effort, and very little's been written about him. But I mean, he's a deeply, conscientious individual, loyal to the army, understands how it can work, and tries his best to coordinate and sort of grip the Russian army tightly, which is what it needs. and he has his doubts about Rasputin. He has his doubts about the Tsar. But he sort of doesn't really know what to do. And I think he then takes a bit of a lead during the crisis in February and March, and then essentially gives the Tsar an ultimatum saying, well, you are going to lose the confidence of your generals, and so you really have to go. Um, and he does this again because he believes that the abdication will enable the Russian war effort to proceed on a smoother. This will put down the revolt and allow the war effort to proceed. And in that, he's desperately wrong. What it does is it really takes the cork off the bottle, and all hell breaks loose.
There is a front that the Tsar leaves behind him, and the front extends from the Gulf of Riga all the way to the Black Sea. And the Austro-Hungarian and the German army, with their allies, have established a front line that is secure, except for there will be breakthroughs. And as Russia disintegrates, its governance disintegrates, at the same time, America is entering the war in the vote in Congress in April. And it's necessary to remember all this action is happening in the Eastern Front, which is regarded as secondary to what's going on in France. Here come the Americans, up to 1 million people, 1 million men army, eventually. And the Germans are calculating all of this. And Falkenhayn, I believe, is at this point, we have to talk about the change from Falkenhayn, the Kaiser's decision to go from Falkenhayn to Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Why?
Falkenhayn has been sparring and arguing with Hindenburg and Ludendorff really since the last days of 1914. Hindenburg and Ludendorff want a commitment to the East. They want more troops in the East because they believe the Russians can be defeated. And in that, they're correct. But Falkenhayn has a much better understanding of the reality of the war and the difficulty that Germany has of balancing both fronts. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff don't really realize this. They're constantly wanting more troops. There's never enough troops to get their hands on. But Falkenhayn is aware of the dangers of the Western Front and how powerful Britain and France are, and he can't withdraw too many divisions or else the front will collapse. And so he's a sort of balancing act, and he is trying to run the war on sensible terms. He commits to the East in 1915, and they overrun Serbia, and they were able to force the Russian army back in a very, very successful campaign. But ultimately, he just sort of is ground down by the process, really. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff seem to offer something better, decisive victory. They have the aura of Tannenberg. And ultimately, the Kaiser, he just becomes worn down with it, really. And so they go through the summer of 1916. You have the Brusilov offensive. You have the heavy fighting on the Somme. You have the Romanian campaign that are brought in. And so the Kaiser begins to really get concerned with how stretched the Germans are. And so they brings in the two men who seem to offer a way out, and that's Hindenburg and Ludendorff. They come in, they're going to take over, and they're going to run that war effort until November of 1918.
All these empires are being torn up. We need to go back to Petrograd and a man named Kerensky. The book is The Eastern Front. Nick Lloyd, professor of modern warfare at King's College London. This is a vast story. Many moving parts. The damage to civilization is profound. It's a measure that we're still dealing with the results. The Second War dealt with it. The Cold War dealt with it. And here in the 21st century, it's not immaterial to historians that the battles are back in the same zones between Russia and Western Europe. When we go now to Russia itself, a man named Kerensky, who's a cabinet officer, not a commander. But quite amazingly, the intention is to continue the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary, despite the switch from the Czar to the Duma, to a cabinet ministers. How was that presented to the troops, Nick? How did they hear that?
Well, it obviously has a very unsettling effect, the application of the Tsar. Russian troops have sworn an oath to the safety of the Romanovs, and so when they're released from that oath, it essentially releases them from duty, and so it's very unsettling. The new provisional government is on weak foundations from the very beginning, and it's having to it's basically held up by socialists, radical socialists in Petrograd that really control the streets and can control the Duma. And so, Kerensky is a minister of war. He's a radical in some respects, but he takes over and works with the prime minister and works with the group there to try and keep the war going because they believe they just have to, or else the revolution or the abdication of the Tsar won't be sustained. And so in some ways they're fighting for the revolution. They're fighting for a new Russia. There is some hope that, now Russia is almost overnight a democracy, or at least it's got a lot of democratic aspects that it didn't have before, that this will mean the Russians will fight on with greater spirit. They will fight for new gods. They will fight for freedom in a way that they hadn't. But obviously this does not ever really happen. And so the Russian army begins to deconstruct. It begins to fall to pieces. They abolish the death penalty for desertion or mutiny. And that is one of the key aspects that you begin to see desertions increase rapidly. And then you get lynching of officers or fragging of officers, we might call it. And so the army, by the spring of 1917, the army is beginning to essentially implode.
The implosion will also consider paranoia. Kerensky is certain there's a plot against him. And it gets extremely confusing who's inside and who's outside of these conspiracies. Because a lot of people talk about it. There's a general named Kornilov, and then there's a general named Krimov who kills himself because he's loyal to the Tsar. Many suicides throughout your book, Nick, and it reminds that the men who fought these wars, especially the officers, had a spiritual connection to the land that no longer translates into modern terms. It's as if their purpose was broken when the state was broken, or they were asked to break the state. Is that how to read it now? Their spiritual attachment to empire shattered them.
Yeah, it's a great break. And obviously what you have is there is a group of officers led by Kornilov who are increasingly concerned about the direction of travel and who want to essentially take on the socialists and increasingly have the Bolshevik Party. Then Lenin comes back in April. They want to take on these people, use the army to smash the radical socialists and restore order in that sense. And so they're concerned that if these people continue, the war will collapse and then the empire will be ripped apart. And so they have to take it. So there isn't the ins and outs of the so-called Kornilov affair are actually still quite difficult to unpick today. But essentially, Kerensky allies with the Bolsheviks and imprisons Kornilov and tries to ride the tiger, as it were, to ride the radicals, to maintain power. And he talks about this coup from the right, this right-wing coup. This is going to be crushed and everything. But ultimately, this just weakens the state even more, and it means that even more officers, more senior officers, are looking at Kerensky and the provisional government as not being on their side and actually being very, very dangerous. And of course, this weakens the support for Kerensky's regime. He takes over. And ultimately, there is really no one to defend the regime when the Bolsheviks turn on their masters and then mount the coup d'etat in November of 1917. And Kerensky flees. And so it's a really, the empire really dies with a whimper and not with a bang.
The book is The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. This is the secondary part of the Great War that produced a devil's brew of changes in governance and millions of casualties. I think at one point there were as many casualties in the Russian Civil War from these moments. 2 million is my memory of Nick's reporting, as there were losses in the whole Russian army during 1914 to 1918. And those are not just combatants dying, those are women and the children who starved because of the disturbance that was happening in Petrograd. But two things happened simultaneously on the same day. Devil's sense of humor. There is the storming of the Winter Palace when the Bolsheviks take over in Petrograd. It's Petersburg. It was named Petrograd for a while, and then it was back to Petersburg. Goes back and forth. Now it's Petersburg again. For a while, it was Leningrad. The The second event is the Battle of Caporetto. This again is the Italian front. And as catastrophes go, this is a whopper, considering that it's up against the rest of the failures on the battlefield. What do we need to know about Caporetto and the decision by the leadership in Italy? I believe Orlando was prime minister at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you are right about the devil having a sense of humor, because I think when you see those two campaigns together, which I do in the book, you can see how there's it's a double blow for the Allied cause in that November of 1917. It's possibly one of the darkest moments of the entire war for the Allied powers, where the Bolsheviks take over and the Italian army almost crumbles. And so what you'd had is the gradual intensification of war and battles on that Isonzo front throughout 1915, throughout 1916, and throughout 1917, some enormous battles. One battle on the Isonzo in 1917, the Austrians lose about 130,000 men in 2 weeks. Huge battles, terrible battles. And so the Austrians are increasingly saying to the Germans, look, if there's another attack, our armies aren't going to hold. And so the Germans reluctantly agree to bring in special mountain divisions. They bring in troops, they bring in heavy artillery, and they're going to basically outflank the Isonzo line by attacking north at Tolmine, as it was known. And at this point, the Italians are in bad positions. They're over the river. The weather is bad. They are assuming they're just going to go onto another offensive at some point. Their morale is poor. They've had a very, very heavy summer of fighting. And it's at that point where these new tactics that the Germans have been developing, stormtroop tactics, we would call them today, are used. And this very rapidly, within about 2 days, the Italian army is sort of stranded. Lots of it stranded on the wrong side of the river. The bridges are blown, and they just capitulate in large numbers. And then what's left of the army streams back to the west, eventually behind the River Piave. It's a massive retreat. Lose about 300,000 men, hundreds of guns, indeed thousands of guns, huge tons and tons of supplies. And so at a stroke, the Italian army has lost all the territory it had gained at such cost, and is facing complete extinction. So the ghosts of Caporetto are still there, and it's one of those battles which is absolutely destructive. And so at this point, November 1917, there's a real window of opportunity for the Central Powers, perhaps the last time they really get one, where they are able to decide the war in their favor. It's truly decisive.
Yes, but it occurs to me, Professor, the irony of this, as if there's an author somewhere, that success at Caporetto and the stories of the Winter Palace storming and the Bolsheviks who won out of the war. And we immediately enter into Brest-Litovsk negotiations of the Russian ceasefire. That gives confidence to Hindenburg and Ludendorff that one throw of the dice will win it all. Is that an irony, or am I seeing something that's not real? Did they take those events as, I don't know, sort of like the powers are with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're aware that now the wheel has turned full circle in a way. Now they can return to the West, and so they can't really believe their luck with what's happening. And there's a sense now that things have come to a decisive point. And so in November, the German High Command made that decision that actually the Austrians wanted them to continue the campaign against Italy. They said, look, the Italians have been badly shaken, but they're not out of the war yet. They're not suing for peace. So if we can continue to hammer them, we can knock Italy out. But within a week or two of Caporetto, the Germans are wanting to pull their divisions back out to go west. And so you have the ceasefire, you have obviously the temporary cessation of hostilities in the east, where the Bolsheviks are suing for peace. You have the somewhat tortuous negotiations at Brest-Litovsk, where Trotsky comes as one of the revolutionaries, and there's long sermons about international peace and solidarity and how the Germans are going to lose, and they need to have this type of a peace, and it's almost quite comic in a way, where the German generals are looking at Trotsky saying, well, look, you've lost, you're suing for peace. And so eventually they get an agreement. The treaty is signed in March, early March, and then of course the the Germans finally are free, or at least freed up to fight a one front war. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff cannot lose this opportunity of dealing with the Allies finally before the Americans can arrive in strength. There's a sense of poetry in 1918. Things come full circle. It all comes back to it. And of course, the war will then be decided. It's been decided in the East, and it now comes to be decided in the West.
Yes, in Berlin. Is the opinion we won in the East? Did they celebrate it as a victory, or are they so overwhelmed by Paris that they can't think about it?
No, I mean there's a direct. I mean they're obviously becoming very exhausted at this point. The strains really are there, and the Austrians are squeaking. The Austrians are squealing very loudly about peace.
Right.
The Austrians are becoming very, very exhausted, and so there is huge strains at this point in the war effort. But I think the German High Command are finally, they're getting the fruits of their labors almost. They've been hammering at Russia, and it's finally collapsed. They've overrun Romania. They've overrun Serbia. They've almost delivered a crippling blow to the Italians. So at this point, they are victorious in the East. Without question, they have won. And now they decide, essentially like a gambler staying in the casino, that instead of leaving with their winnings, they're going to go for that next big show.
Lenin commands Russia. Orlando commands Italy. In the West, Lloyd George is in London. He's leading London. Clemenceau is in Paris. Kaiser's in Berlin. And in Vienna, one more introduction. Karl, Emperor Karl, a very young man. What do we need to know about him, Nick?
He's obviously the last Habsburg emperor. Franz Josef dies in I think it's November of 1916. And so he takes over. And his view is that, he wants peace. He wants to put out peace feelers to the Entente. These ultimately fail because of Italian war demands. The Italians want Austrian land, and so the British and French can't really settle with the Austrians because of the presence, obviously, of Italy, who aren't really informed of these developments. And so the peace feelers they don't really go anywhere. But Emperor Karl is committed to peace, and he is continually telling the Kaiser that they need to get serious about this. They cannot continue the war for any longer, because if you do, you will be swept away like the Czar was. This is the line from Vienna, and ultimately Karl is correct in this. Karl's an interesting figure because he's always written off as this sort of naive young boy, this man, this sort of rather pathetic figure. But he sees very, very clearly the dilemma that the Central Powers face, but also that this is a new world now with the Bolshevik Revolution, and they have to be very, very careful. And of course, the Kaiser just ignores him.
Ignores him at that moment. We come now to Italy's one last stab. This is now October of 1918. The battles in France have come to a success for the Americans, the British, the Canadians, the Australians. And they've launched their counteroffensive, and Hindenburg and Ludendorff have been proven wrong that they could break the Allies with the concentration of troops. The Kaiser's been proven wrong. Karl's been proven right. And yet, the oddest thing, the Italians launch a campaign in September, October of 1918. Why, Nick? All those casualties. I wondered, what were they achieving?
Well, the Italian army after Caporetto it goes back behind the Piave River and then is steadily rebuilt. The British and French bring in divisions, they bring in their artillery, they bring in their air power, they bring in coal and supplies. And over the winter of 1917 and the spring of 1918, the Italian army is essentially reconstructed. One of those little known stories of the war. But the Italian army is rebuilt. General Armando Diaz is the man that's tasked with bringing it back to life. And it is one of those almost incredible resurrection moments. They've actually to come back. And they launch a number of battles along the Piave. And of course, the final offensive, the second battle of the Piave, is the one where they attack, they cross the river, they destroy whatever Austrian divisions are left, and the Austrian army finally collapses. Its men are starving, riddled with hunger, disease. The Hungarians are deciding to leave the battlefield to fight for homeland. And so this battle is decisive, and that's it. The Italians emerge victorious finally.
And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken in pieces, never to be put together again. When we come back, the results of this catastrophe. Nick Lloyd is the author of The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. These are lands and territories and borders we talk about here in the 21st century because they're not settled. They can be threatened. And yet this is the moment leading to the Treaty of Versailles, where all the Austro-Hungarian Empire's kingdoms are cut up and dealt out as if there's a deck of cards and they're choosing which ones they want to associate with. There were 4 results of the war, 4 entities that come out of the defeated Central Powers. My list here following Nick's reporting: the German-Austrian, and we'll see that again in 1939, 38 and 39, Hungary, the Czechoslovakia, and the one that's most made up of pieces, Yugoslavia. None of those actually describe, well, like Hungary does, describe a nationality that's homogenous. They all describe pieces of different nationalities. And the Austro-Hungarians felt that at the time. Was that, and the treaties you talk about, Nick, the treaties could be extremely punitive on these parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Was there perception at the time that we're building a brittle organization that could fall apart again?
The collapse of these, the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, is devastating for the cohesion of the region. And obviously all of those, there are a number of new states that emerge at this point. Poland, Czechoslovakia, obviously Yugoslavia, and enlarged Serbia. Romania, grows. Hungary shrinks. It's very difficult to disentangle all of the competing ethnicities and national groupings in that part of Europe. And so it's incredibly messy and incredibly difficult to see. And this is what the victors have to deal with. Most of their time is spent trying to work out what is going to happen to Central and Eastern Europe, because it's almost as if a great vacuum has opened. The Russian Empire is dissolved and the civil war in Russia is taking place. And so Poland emerges, the states in the Baltics emerge. They're weak, dependent on patronage and support from the West. And of course, it's very, very unstable. These are weak states, having to incorporate new ethnic groupings, having to build new ethnic national loyalties. And of course, they're not ultimately not able to stand. And that story obviously goes through the up to the Second World War. And so the ultimately results of this, the problems just carry on. They don't really get resolved in any form or way, or at least resolved satisfactorily.
There was a sense, I believe at some point you characterized it this way, that the war didn't end, that it moved to arguments that would lead to another go. The treaty you picked out as being the most punitive of all was the Treaty of Trianon. Do I say that correctly?
Yeah. Obviously, this is the one that Hungary has bits torn off it from all the surrounding states. I feel very bad about it for decades. Indeed, it's still a sore point in Hungarian political life today. But yeah, I mean, it's just one of those indications of the peace treaties which don't necessarily really satisfy anyone, but they're very, very difficult decisions to make, and you have to reward your allies, you have to reward the partners that played a role in the defeating of the Central Powers. But this is just an indication of how dangerous the war is, and how it, what emerges is not necessarily any better than what had preceded it. In many ways, is far weaker.
Yes, what I learned from you, again, we return to those thoughts. War is manageable. Wrong. Being perceived as weak means you have to fight. Wrong. Empires. These empires all crash. They're all gone. Is there sentiment, nostalgia about them? Or are they transformed, the men and women at the time?
I mean, I don't think there's much nostalgia for them at the time when they go in 1918. There may well be lingering groups, but I think there's a sort of bright new world that's opening up in some respects, or at least a brave new world. But of course, you do see increasingly a kind of nostalgia for the Habsburg Empire, and nostalgia even for the family of the Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. What's the sort of proto, cult of personality with the Tsar? And I think there's a feeling that Europe clearly lost something in that war, and lost a great deal, and kind of sense of European destiny and power it has never recovered. And so, yeah, I think there is that nostalgia which sort of lingers over what the war did to Central and Eastern Europe. And going back to your earlier point, yeah, the war ends very clearly in the West, on the Western Front, but it never really ends in the East, or at least it goes on at least until the early 1920s before it's sort of settled, or at least temporarily.
Yes, whatever happened to. I didn't make a complete list, but I started to write down the Russian generals who are executed, who are murdered by their troops or by the Bolsheviks. Rennenkampf, the man who lost Tannenberg, it was as if he was on a temporary pass all those years, and he's arrested and executed because he wouldn't join the Red Army. Alexeyev, what is the volunteer army?
Volunteer army is a sort of ramshackle band of officers and men, predominantly officers actually from the old Russian Imperial Army that go south in increasing numbers as 1917 goes on, and particularly after the Bolsheviks take over and they reform into so-called volunteer movement, and they become known as the Whites, of course. Exactly what they fight for is still somewhat unclear, but obviously they're fighting against the radical socialists and Bolsheviks that now control the heartland, the center point of Russia, with Petrograd and Moscow. And Alexeyev is one of the volunteer leaders until he dies in 1918. But yeah, the war carries on in that sense. And that really surprised me, just the number of, because it's a story that's never really told in the West. What happens to the Tsar's generals? Most of them, either flee or are executed. And there's only a few that really get out of that period alive. Brusilov actually joins the Red Army, and of course he's never forgiven by his former comrades.
Conrad, where does he go?
Conrad retires and goes to Vienna and starts writing his memoirs, which are unfinished, and then sort of pens articles about how the war was forced on Austria and it was a very glorious struggle, and they were really betrayed by their friends. And so, it's quite of a, he's trying to obviously justify his actions as one would expect. But yeah, he sort of lives that for another 10 years, I think, before he finally dies.
It's very difficult to find a happy ending, so I'm going to come close. Karl dies, very young man. I believe he's in his early 30s, in 1922 or 24. But today you tell me that the Pope is moving to make him a saint. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's obviously he's on that path to sainthood. Whether he'll get there, who knows? But obviously there is a campaign for his, believing that he was, a peacemaker, a man who tried to bring the war to an end. One of the few who was largely blameless for the war, and obviously was deeply concerned with the welfare of his people, and obviously a deeply devout Catholic. And so Karl is seen, I think, as a man who potentially had the chance to unite the empire one last time. And so there is that cult of personality around Karl, around the idea that he was a man of great wisdom and peace. And so, yeah, I end the book with Karl because I think it offers some kind of light at the end, really.
I agree with you, Nick, and congratulations. The book is The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. Nick Lloyd is the author. I'm John Batchelor.